I'm going to present something that is very much a work in progress. So I hope in a way it's taken as something to contribute toward a conversation that I look forward to having with you. And in the setup, I was trying to somehow imagine what kind of dialogues could be relevant in this discussion of refiguration. And I guess in a way, the presentation I'll give is going to be a dance together with maybe these three types of discussions. Maybe one, a kind of refiguration of the ontological space of what is the city and the urban and this transformation, and what that might mean also for a kind of epistemological refiguration of how we approach knowledge making, or how do we learn and produce knowledge about the city or the urban. And then the last, this question of its relation obviously to praxis or praxeological refiguration, about the making and the doing of the urban. And I'll kind of run through these four stages where I hope to, in a way, connect some of these discussions and perhaps have a dialogue, hopefully, with the work that you're doing. Maybe the starting point for this discussion, and many of the examples that I will give are more from an academic and teaching context around how we approach questions of how we approach design, how we think about design in a kind of shifting and changing context. And how the role of design might, in a way, relate to that context. So the first of these might be about this question of a shifting ontology that we could start with. And of course, I present this from the perspective of an architect and urbanist, where we look at the work, for example, of Amin Thrift, where there's this discussion of the kind of alignment or overlay of the notion of the Anthropocene with its history of urbanization itself. The notion that urbanization processes are the prime mover of the Anthropocene. And even that being taken further by someone like Michel Lussault in his work of developing this concept of what is described as the Urbanocene, the notion of aligning this development of the urbanization processes of our planet to this larger discussion of the concept of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration. The notion that these kinds of curves that you're all familiar with also map onto the curve of the urbanization process. And what this means, obviously, is have many impacts on how we understand what the city is, our kind of conventional mutual understanding of a constantly developing understanding of, let's say, a movement currently away from the notion of a morphological or bounded notion of urban entities or cities toward a much more, let's say, interrelated field of relational understandings of, if we follow Brenner and Schmidt's notion of planetary urbanization. The notion here, of course, of understanding cities as rather as objects, more understanding them as processes in which they're entangled as one, let's say, materialization of a larger, let's say, development that we see that includes these operational landscapes of the globe, operational landscapes that might be sites of extraction, energy generation, agriculture, logistics, and waste disposal. So I'm interested in how this kind of shifting logic might change also how we look at the spaces of the city. In the work that we did in the Atlas of the Copenhagens, we were in a way trying to question the formulation of Copenhagen as a model city through this notion of livability and the notion of sustainable city, and actually arguing that, in fact, the city is an entirely entangled and reliant upon these kinds of spaces, whether these are spaces of large-scale logistics, cement processing, extraction, or agricultural production. And in a way, the Atlas was trying, through the plurality of understanding not one Copenhagen, but multiple Copenhagens, was talking about different scales of understanding these relations and different logics of how the interconnectivity of the city as a kind of object of both city branding and intercity competition could be understood much more in relation to these processes. I'll just take a quick sip of water here. And in a way, in this work, we're exploring, let's say, what this might mean for different kinds of reframings. Reframings of both how we understand and produce knowledge around the city and its larger urban developments and urban, let's say, urbanization processes, but also how we might practice within them. And what I'm going to show is maybe move quickly through a series of different, let's say, understandings of relations that, and then I'm going to go deeper into the last one and then maybe show some other examples of how we might experience or think about that. So one of these might be about how we might shift from a kind of understanding of the city and the nearness into its relationship to the far. And we might see how this is in a way played out through different forms of work here, where we see in the work of Lindsay Wickstrom and within David Benjamin's project of the embodied energy book, this notion of trying to connect and relate the actual site of production of architecture and urbanism to the site of extraction, to the processes in which this entire production is related. Or we can think of Jazenbeck and Prakash's work with the idea of the deconstructed house, which relates, of course, also to the relationship in distance to the impacts of the design of the architecture. So the idea here of the locations of the source points and extraction locations of the different materials and logics that go into this house project that you see on the right-hand side here. And how this also relates to a discussion that we've seen in recent years toward the awareness of a non-extractive possibility of our field. We're here in the work of Charlotte Malter-Barth, connecting the presentation here of a so-called sustainable wooden table to its far and distant sites, and all of, let's say, the questions of the colonial inheritance of violence, pollution, imperialism, and so forth that plays out here in the Congo River Valley that we see here, the Congo Basin. And the way that this might relate also to an increasing awareness of the interaction between our field and larger systems and larger logics, where here in Patel and Moore talk about or write about this notion of cheap natures upon which much of the recent centuries of capitalist development, mechanization and extraction have relied. And the notion here of here, if we look at the work of Carl William Kapp, that very much we understand this contemporary system of a modern economy being about the notion of unpaid costs, the idea of the innovation of capitalism being about subtracting long-term costs and moving the actual costs, displacing them elsewhere, both in time and space. So in that sense, many of the students, and I show a couple of very quick student examples, and I don't have time to go into them in great depth, but some of the students are working in their own projects on questions of repairing these far and distant landscapes and trying to work, for example, with local communities. Here in the case of Austin's work in the western areas of Australia, where he's been working and trying to look into these sites of extraction here with iron ore mines in Western Australia, and linking those to a project of both environmental restoration, but also non-human and human reinhabitation in relation to a discussion of coming to terms with what these kinds of landscapes have done to the possibilities of the relationship to the landscape of the indigenous people in this context. Or another pair of students here, Ona and Mona, who have been working on the practices of nomads in southern Turkey and the challenges that these nomads have in this context of working between the developments that are taking place of, for example, solar cell expansion, as well as quarries and other forms of extraction that have in a way pushed out the traditional patterns of nomadic movement, where their project has been trying to, in a way, negotiate those conflicts and try to embed through design how the coexistence of this nomadic population and community could actually relate to that landscape that, in a way, is under great pressure for expansion of solar cell development and also further material extraction. Another would be this question of the visible or the invisible that we can relate to many discussions. The fact that much of what might not be materially visible is in a way something that we are increasingly in a way attached to and aware of, whether that's through a kind of metabolic understanding that could draw on the work here of the 1970s Belgian group, or whether we see more recently intention to, in a way, build in representational systems that could, in a way, make visible those things that are both invisible but deeply, let's say, central to the issues of what's at stake to us today. And that might be, for example, the notion of visualizing the invisible of embodied energy in the work here, and how this attempt to try to come up with visual formats for, in a way, mapping and documenting and trying to work with this as a kind of design material, what would normally be how to visualize it, how to quantify it, how to see it as a kind of plasticine of work. But also how this notion of the invisible is also that which may come. It could be landscapes of risk, landscapes that in a way relate to things that might happen, but also landscapes that have to do with perhaps the more dynamic and fluid of the social realm. Here in Jan Rathhausen's work, where we see, of course, a representation of over-tourism, we can see in the context of Amsterdam, or in the work of Laura Kogan, trying to map, in this case, the impact of the American incarceration system in the home addresses that are mapped into these locations here, finding, in a way, arguments for, in a way, redistributing the funds and resources that are placed into imprisoning this population with these clusters into actually investing locally in that space. So the role of making this visible, of course, becomes a platform for a shifted discussion. It might also be how we might visualize the underlying power relations and how these underlying relations might in a way, correspond or in a way be informed by, let's say, thinking that might come from someone like Keller Easterling, and this notion of the disposition that is in a way reading the system and looking to, let's say, signs either below the surface or just on the surface, here using the analogy of Mark Twain as a steamboat captain, where passengers were seeing these beautiful pictures of this landscape. Rather, he was trying to look for the face of the water and understanding the ripples and systems within this kind of dense space of the Mississippi. And for her, of course, this represents this notion of the agency, inherent agency into these systems, which she's interested in designing with, of course, within this logic of protocols. And in the work, we're also interested in the students trying to push this notion of how an understanding of that which lies below the surface or is in a way hidden in the complexity of the surface can become a platform for entering projects and design in different ways. To enter here, for example, by understanding the economic and political dynamics, in this case, of the ground floor of Copenhagen, and how, in a way, working through these logics and questioning them and going into them from different directions, also in discussions with local communities, to look into how this might, in a way, spring other kinds of imaginaries for the ground floor as a new, let's say, vivid and dynamic civic space that might challenge our idea of the healthy commercial ground floor that, in a way, much has been driven towards. Or the idea here in this project from Jana and McGann, which was trying to work with understanding the logistical logics of spatial organization in the city, and how this thinking and understanding of these hidden logics of the logistics system in time and space could suggest a rethinking of the typology of logistics, spatially and also socially. In this case, in a way, embedding these large-scale boxes also into public and civic infrastructure in a way, through parks and other kinds of infrastructures. And this one, which I won't spend a lot of time on, but of course also this idea of an increasing awareness, whether we work with Sarah Watmore's notion of simply that we cannot continue to think of urbanism being an exclusively human project, or of course with a lot more developments in this discussion, whether we're talking about Haraway or many others in this field, this notion of increasingly a responsibility or a kind of prerogative, I should say, to make kin and to learn to live and die with each other, and whether we see that in projects like the Feral Atlas, or here in the work of Fifi Zhou within that project, the attempt to try to, of course, the soil map that many of you are familiar with, and in the work that our students are trying to do also in exploring how this kind of perspective might challenge many of our existing, let's say, understandings of design logics and design moves. In this case, in discussing and exploring the possibility for regenerative farming within a large sort of tradition in Denmark of industrial farming, to explore what kind of, let's say, spatial and, in this case, also social and interspecies possibilities might play out through this movement and transformation from an industrial farming paradigm into a regenerative one that's based also on considering different users within this environment, users that might represent different species or different forms of vegetation, and how these interactions might become also a platform for designing. And then the fourth is this discussion, of course, of scale, and this idea of moving and considering what it might mean to shift our understanding from a scale focus that might be based on the object or the building or what we had called the human scale, and how an understanding of how the multiscalar and also the transscalar, of course, also inspired by this kind of understanding that also Martina has described about all these interactions that relates, of course, to a large discussion in different fields, of course, a key discussion in geography, but also in other social sciences and humanities around what's at stake when we talk about scale and what it means to consider scale, particularly within an understanding in our field from a professional standpoint, which in a way tends to associate this idea of the Russian doll of related structural scales as a kind of, in a way, a given within which our field as a profession works. And of course, we see a lot of discussion about those even at the extreme end wanting to completely, in a way, undo or unravel or disassociate ourselves from the notion of scale. And whether that comes from questions applied to it from here Latour, or in the case of Thrift, but also others, for example, Anna Singh and her questioning of scale as a social construction. And I think that what we see in this is this discussion also of the relationship between the multiscalar and the transscalar, and let's say different competing, let's say, conceptions of the multiscalar, which would be still understanding the hierarchy of these different scales, but understanding the interrelation and dynamism between them, versus the transscalar, which much more radically is trying to question those existing hierarchies and trying to, in a way, let's say, undo them and explore what might be a much more networked and fluid relationship between how we might understand different scale logics. And in this way, we can see, an interest within the group that I'm involved in the academy where we're teaching, in exploring what that might mean, to explore what it might mean to move and try to, in a way, encompass and represent this relationship and interchange between scales. This is a result of one project that I did with students in Hong Kong that was trying to, in a way, work from an object that was a project in the foreground, and then tried to chart and map through one single drawing the scale relationships between, for example, the conditions of everyday life for the workers of the concrete factory, but also the relationship to the sites of extraction and the different processes and their impact, for example, environmentally and socially within that context. So how could we think about other forms of representation that start to, in a way, link and relate scale relations? And so that's what I'm going to expand a little bit on here and dive into this discussion of scale and what that might mean for, let's say, traditionally how it's been understood within my field, we say, of architecture and urban planning. And of course, it's linked to these conceptions that, in a way, we could see as partial hangovers from the idea of the continuous zoom of control and, in a way, desire that's attached to the zoom. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So the starting point for this is at the academy, also this notion of how scale in our field is embedded also into the structures of our, in a way, our institutions. At the academy, we have roughly 13 master programs that are also in some way relationally organized according to scale. And the one that I'm leading, called Urbanism, Societal Change, is often referred to as a planning program, or the program which deals with the large scale. And we have a program that goes all the way to the idea of the furniture architect or the interior architect on the left-hand side, and then those who are thought of as building architects in the middle. And this large-scale tradition in a Danish context, so it's related, of course, to this tradition of the architect, in a Danish context, the architect planner. Just as I said, the architecture furniture designer. So our graduates graduate as architects, but with specialization in urban planning and large scale, in a dialogue with the understanding of this multiscalar, let's say, ideal of the architect, able also to design a teaspoon to designing an urban plan, which was, of course, this dream of kind of modernist total design that we're also in a constant state of challenging and rethinking. The idea that this idea of the large scale links to also different cultural contexts where we're discussing different understandings of, for example, some of these might be more morphological in their focus, some might be more procedural, others might be more, let's say, understanding as social dynamics in these systems. And what I think is interesting is to think about, let's say, an ambivalence in these discussions between a sort of professional reality of an understanding of different forms of structuring of our field, but also how this kind of scalar-based thinking is also deeply problematic in a way, something that we try to actively challenge. And that's something that's fundamentally questioned. And what we're trying to do in a way is explore how, in a way, this sense of the challenges and the issues we face, how do they become a platform for, in a way, entering through different trajectories that may not be defined by the scale of planning, but might move between different logics of design and strategic thinking. And in doing that, what we're trying to do, and that's why I show this example, because I think it relates also to this idea of how our field and scale has played out, between this idea of, on the left-hand side, a sort of a tradition of a building architect focused, for example, on the notion of the object, to give shape and form to the object, to think of the produced work as a completed work, in a way as finished, versus other logics which may relate more to a strategic or planning or more perhaps multi and transcalar impact. And that's why what we try to work with is both, in a way, building upon the competencies of the left-hand side, but trying to build and develop with the right-hand side. And what that might mean is both understanding the role of, through Keller Easterling's thinking, object form, but also thinking through the logic of active form as another species that enables certain kinds of design capacities. The idea of thinking also of not only designing through shape and form, but through organization and rule sets, if we follow Alex Lehner's work. Or the idea of thinking about a shift from the notion of the completed work and the composition toward the idea of the dynamic and strategic game board. Or the idea, of course, in our traditional sense of a Städtebau tradition or a morphological tradition of not only reading figures, but reading ground and relations and fabric, also designing and thinking through void, but also through the idea of thinking about the possibility of scalar discontinuities between different forms of singular acupunctural intervention. The idea that also our relationship between different context understandings might change and expand to see other kinds of relations in other contexts that might not be represented in the ground of the left-hand project, for example. But also how this means also a lot in terms of how we think spatially about the field of architecture and planning, away from the notion of the singularity of a certain one-on-one relation into much more complex spaces of dynamic interaction. The idea here of also thinking about expanded fields of understanding economics or ecology, here with the idea of understanding trees in a total budgeting context as a value rather than a cost to a municipality. And how this also, in a way, impacts more, let's say, directly on a discussion of scale, where a project that might be understood as a detail of addition in the case of this La Catana Vassal project can in fact be understood also as a large-scale prototype for something that might have massive impact at the scale of the right-hand side, but in a way is built upon and in a way conceived at the level of the detail on the left-hand side. So this idea of thinking of this design project as something which operates across this discontinuous space. And if you imagine this video, which, because it's a PDF, it's not a video, but there's this zoom out, of course, from the hand out and then back into in a way, the cells and the atoms of the hand. There's this, of course, fundamental critique in this discussion of scale about this notion of continuity that we see from Latour. And we see, I think, some really interesting, in a way, other kinds of discussions about scale going on or starting up in our field at the moment. André Haquet's project, which is, of course, in a way, grounded in a discussion of scale and the transcalar. Here, in this case, is obviously also a critique about the powers of 10 and the scalar thinking as something that was highly apolitical, techno-rational, but also exclusionary in the universe that this has set up, and asking, can we rethink this construction of scale and in a way challenge it fundamentally? And I think a project that is developed later by him in his office is fascinating in trying to, in a way, work with all these dimensions of the near and far, the visible and invisible, but also, of course, the transcalar and the idea of trying to map the relationship between the selling and promoting and marketing of this area, the Hudson Yards in New York City, that's based on all kinds of complex, let's say, gymnastics of jet engines that will cool down the heated railway tracks, gymnastics dealing with trying to connect vulnerable districts into the same area to allow for subsidies, but also dealing with this relationship between the glass and, in a way, the micromolecular structure of the glass, and the importance of, let's say, how the scale of performance of the glass on the right-hand side, which is this very clear glass, and the impact of this in the location where those materials are extracted. So in this case, in South Africa, where the material that has been extracted from, that you can see as the darker dust, the darker material, which, because it's lighter, is in a way becoming a dust that gets blown around and goes into the lungs and produces a lot of health problems in this context, where we see all kinds of issues around how we understand the scale relationships of a project like this, of course inspired by this kind of thinking. And I think we can also see here another critique, which I think is also important, and I think is really productive, which is the critique of Philippe Boudon around this notion of an arbitrariness of scale. And I think what I think is really interesting and productive about Boudon's notion of a kind of architecturology is the logic here of him suggesting this notion of, rather than thinking of scale, focusing on the notion of a relevance of giving measure. So he talks about the logic of different measures that represent a different notion of scale that might move from, for example, the functional scale to the semantic scale, to the notion of the geometric, the economic, the geographical, the neighboring, and so forth. And I think that there's a sophistication in the intention to challenge this, in a way, smoothness of the zoom, which opens up questions around how we understand the logic, not of the numbers on the left or the breakdown, but more the performance and their interaction and the relational construction of how these different elements relate between a technical and a functional understanding of design to a geographical and topological understanding at the top. Of course, all these are the same project here by Sana. And how these questions of the relationship between scales and abstraction and the tools we have to represent the same thing through different scales also relates to how, for example, scales still work. And I think that that's, when I talk about an ambivalence in scale, I'm interested in this idea of how still the operational mechanisms that we work with within urban design, architecture, and planning are incredibly linked to the idea here of scale. That scale at 1 to 500 is a classical scale that moves between the logics of the urban and the architectural, that defines the relation between the semi-private and the semi-public, and the public and private. It becomes a tool, in a way, to describe very specific things that's quite different from another scale. And in that sense, I'm in a way in this kind of conversation with myself and the environment around us, around both the question of how we challenge scale, but also how we continue to use it. How scale becomes very, in a way, instrumental in different ways. Here, a specific scale of representation that's here based on testing the acoustics of this environment that requires a certain scale. Another kind of scale here that's about a test of the relationship of the body to the space of the hotel room. A scale that's about relating the speed of experience to the visual language and operations of the space. And in this sense, the work that our students have been doing, there's also this interest in how to move between these different scales. Here in a project by Alexander, which was looking at the rebuilding strategies of Aleppo and Syria, which was focusing on how one could look at different scale logics that might, in a way, define different approaches. So whether that's the approach of how to rebuild the Occidental Courtyard House in this context, which is a functional economic logic, to a material logic that we see here in exploring how rubble could become a building material, and how this building material of the rubble could also suggest certain qualities and sensations of public surfaces and public spaces in the work. Or here in the work of Astrid and Wilde, where they were exploring how a kind of carbon budgeting could set up another scale over time, of rather than building out these large open plans on greenfield sites, they would rather look at a relationship between building and carbon sequestering, where there would be a constant relationship between the planting of trees and the maturing of trees and the possibility for building within them. So it would be, in a way, a spatial dialogue between, in a way, a sequestering material and a non-sequestering material. And I think we can say that in this context, we can see very much this notion of how we could continue with Boudon's, in a way, approach to asking all kinds of questions about what other kinds of scales might be missing, what other kind of, in a way, micrograins of the metabolic might we need to, in a way, account for what might be other microscales of the ecological or the social that might be attached to that. One example of that might be, of course, this shift from the arbitrary border of the socially constructed municipal boundary into this discussion of ecological systems where we talk about bioregionalism as another way of scaling or thinking. So to finish up, I think that we can talk about, and that's why I tried to show these examples along the way to kind of point, maybe this is not a sort of conclusive answer to how we should design towards refiguration, but rather I think it's to say that this discussion of the refiguration of our practices is in a way a deeply contemporary discussion. One in which, just as an example of some publications that are in the middle of, let's say, trying to ask what would be the refiguring of our disciplinary position and how might that position in a way open up entirely new logics for how we might act. That might be both how we, in a way, gather knowledge and the starting point we might start from in the case of Down to Earth, here with this notion of needing to inventory and survey and measure everything, and how this might also challenge our existing assumptions and spatial imaginaries. So the idea of the imaginary of the good city that's sustainable because it's compact, when we take into account the assumption that we had excluded embodied energy and focused very much on operational energy, that entirely questions, let's say, the format that you see here of the representation of how the good city is produced and constructed. And in that sense, I think very much, and I think it was also something that came up, is this critical capacity, if we follow Stan Allen's position, of the possibility of our field from the architecture, but we can also say spatial design and planning position, that it, in a way, our critical capacity lies in positioning alternatives to contrast these existing realities with an exemplary alternative. And that might be generous, that might be, in a way, opening, that might, in a way, be challenging, and so forth. So I thought to just finish very quickly, just to show some examples from a project of one of our students, Astrid Broquist, who's working in a deindustrialized town in the middle of Sweden, where she was, in a way, deeply researching on-site and discussing with a lot of members of that community and analyzing many aspects of this setting, and trying to, in a way, engage different groups socially in that environment, but also trying to be very specific about the qualities and, in a way, conditions of what was there between the very curated and, in a way, let's say, looked after, and on the one hand, that which has been left to degrade, to try to, in a way, build up, in her work, a sensitivity to this idea of the depopulation of the town, not necessarily seen as a negative thing, but simply the starting point for the development toward other forms of inhabitants. In this case, toward the relationship toward other scales of connectivity that, in a way, the town and its development might facilitate. The notion here of, in a way, thinking through the handing back of the town to a form of nature and how these processes of decay might, in a way, challenge and open up other ways, and how that might be facilitated by other kinds of relationships, and how that might set up, let's say, other verbs and other forms of action for how a designer might operate. So that this might, in a way, set up another language and another set of logics for what they might do. And in this sense, in a way, working between the existing condition and how this kind of long-term transformation might play out into other kind of aesthetic textures and social relations in that particular context. So I'll finish there. I've used all the time. Thank you.